You already know something most people your age were never supposed to learn. Not because someone taught it to you, because someone took something from you, or many things, over many years, and left you standing there with nothing but the weight of the lesson and the silence that follows a loss no one else saw coming. And somewhere in that silence, something changed. Something hardened. Not in the brittle way glass hardens. In the way iron does. Through fire. Through pressure. Through the very specific cruelty of time. They call it getting older. They mean it as a consolation. A participation trophy for surviving decades. Oh, look at you, still standing. How quaint, how resilient. But here's what they won't say, what the motivational posters can't say, because the truth doesn't sell supplements or seminars. The people who have lived past 40 have something the young and the eager and the endlessly optimistic simply do not possess. Not wisdom exactly. Wisdom is just information dressed up in a robe. I mean, something more dangerous than that. I mean, scar tissue. And scar tissue, you see, doesn't feel the way open wounds do. It doesn't bleed when you press on it. It doesn't flinch. It just sits there, thicker than the skin around it. Harder, more permanent, proof that you were broken and the world didn't get to keep you that way. The young ones see the gray in your hair and the quiet in your eyes, and they call it defeat. They call it settling. They post their sunrise runs and their productivity stacks and their 10-year plans, and they genuinely believe they are ahead of you. Let them. You've been in rooms they haven't entered yet. You've paid tabs they don't even know exist. The question isn't whether your years have changed you. Of course they have. The question, the only one that actually matters, is whether you've figured out yet what those changes are actually worth. You haven't. Not fully. But you're about to. Let's start where it started. Not at 40. Not at 35 when you first noticed the math wasn't adding up. Let's go back further. To the first time someone told you to be realistic. You know exactly which memory just surfaced. Don't pretend you don't. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe a parent. Maybe it was the first time you tried something enormous. Something electric, something that had your whole chest in it. And someone you respected looked at you with that very specific expression. Not cruelty. Something worse. Practicality. The face of a person who had once wanted what you wanted and decided the wanting was the problem, and something in you listened. That's what no one talks about. Not the people who stopped you, but that you listened. That some younger, softer version of you heard the word realistic and started slowly, methodically, dismantling the parts of yourself that made other people uncomfortable. You got practical. You got reasonable. And this is the word they like, stable. You traded the bright, terrifying version of your own life for something that fit in a resume and made sense at dinner parties. And for a while, maybe a long while, you convinced yourself this was maturity, that the burning thing you'd set aside was just immaturity, just youth, just a phase. Then something happened. A number of things happened. A marriage that corroded slowly instead of breaking cleanly. A career that delivered exactly what it promised and nothing it didn't. A moment at 42, or 46, or 51. Standing somewhere entirely ordinary. Your kitchen, your car. A Wednesday afternoon, and the thought arrived without invitation. Is this it? Not dramatically. That's what makes it devastating. There was no music, no epiphany, just a quiet, flat, perfectly calibrated question. Is this it? And instead of answering it, because the answer frightened you, you got busier. You optimized. You found new metrics for the life you already had. You convinced yourself that the discomfort was something to be managed, not heard. Meanwhile, The people younger than you are failing, loudly, posting failures, monetizing failures, wearing their implosions like badges while you had spent decades swallowing yours in private. Swallowing yours in private. Reshaping your face in the mirror until it looked like a person who was fine. Here's what I find interesting about that. You learn through pure repeated exposure to consequence how to survive something without collapsing. You learned it the hard way, the only way it actually gets learned, and then you looked at all that accumulated endurance and called it nothing. Called it ordinary. Called it just your life. Someone I used to spend a great deal of time around had a similar habit. Very committed individual. Very thorough. Who had absorbed an almost theatrical of and pain on behalf of others, and had become so practiced at absorbing it in silence that he genuinely could not tell the difference anymore between strength and suppression. He had mistaken the ability to endure for a personality. I found that both impressive and deeply, deeply funny. But you built something from it. You just haven't named it yet. The real pain point isn't the failure. It's not the disappointment, the delay, the decades of course correcting. The real wound is the refusal to recognize that the person who got through all of that is meaningfully, measurably, irreversibly different from who they would have been without it. You are standing on the other side of 1,000 small catastrophes, and you are still describing yourself in the language. Age of someone who hasn't survived anything yet? You still apologize for being tired? You still edit your opinions before you speak? You still measure yourself against 25-year-olds who are still running on the confidence of people who haven't been truly tested yet? And the question underneath all of that, the one you've been avoiding since you started watching this, is simple. When are you going to stop explaining yourself to people who haven't earned the right to understand you? Jaded. That's their word for you, isn't it? That's their word for you, isn't it? The generous ones say experienced. The less generous ones say bitter. The ones who've never lost anything say resistant to change. None of these are the correct word. Jaded means deadened. Jaded means the nerve endings stopped firing and the lights went out behind the eyes. What you have is the opposite of that. What you have is calibrated. A machine that has been tested in the field, broken, repaired, modified, not in a factory, by someone who read the manual, but in the actual terrain, under actual pressure, with actual consequences. You are not dulled. You are precise. The label jaded is applied by people who want the world to retain its power, to manipulate them. They need to believe that hope is infinite and stakes are low. And every new thing deserves the same bright-eyed rush. Because if experience teaches you something, if it meaningfully changes your responses, then it means they might also one day be changed. And that terrifies them more than almost anything. You are not jaded. You are accurate. And accuracy feels cold to people still running on illusion. Here's the thing about resilience that nobody says clearly enough. It does not come from good experiences. It cannot. Good experiences give you confidence, and confidence is useful, but confidence is breakable. Confidence depends on continued success. Resilience, the actual thing, the structural thing, comes from surviving the experiences you are certain you would not survive. You did not choose this. Let's be honest about that. Nobody auditions for heartbreak. Nobody volunteers for financial ruin or medical terror or the slow erasure of a life they thought they understood. You did not build your resilience on purpose. But the brain, your brain, the one that has now recorded several decades of outcomes, It has done something remarkable without your permission. It has developed a library, not of facts, of probabilities. Every time you face something enormous and came out the other side, your nervous system updated its threat assessment. You have a physiological, measurable, neurological advantage over anyone who hasn't accumulated what you've accumulated. And that advantage doesn't live in your memories. It lives in your reflexes. The young have speed. You have depth. And in any encounter that actually matters, in any conversation, any crisis, any moment that requires more than surface response, depth wins. Let's look at the one that's doing the judging, because this is always instructive. The people who look at your age and see a limitation or to a person operating from one of two places. Either they are young enough to still believe that the world is a meritocracy that rewards enthusiasm and punishes experience, in which case they're wrong and time will correct them without any intervention from you. Or they are people who are afraid that what happened to you will happen to them. And so they need your experience to be a failure rather than a transformation, because the alternative is that they too might one day be tested. Either way, neither of these is a problem you are obligated to solve. I once watched a very principled man, someone with a remarkable commitment to his own moral framework, spend enormous energy judging of for the messiness of their lives, never broken a rule, never deviated from the structure he'd built. He called it integrity. I called it the fear of a man who had never been forced to find out what he was actually made of. He was protecting a self-image that had never been stress-tested. The most brittle thing in any room is the thing that's never been bent. And he was architecturally a disaster waiting for the right kind of pressure. Their judgment is not about you. Their judgment is about the thing they're afraid of becoming, and you already became it and survived. And that is unbearable to people who are still hoping to avoid it. Let's be specific, not metaphorical. Specific. People over 40, specific. People over 40 who have genuinely engaged with the hardship their lives delivered possess identifiable functional advantages. They do not need external validation to maintain their position. Not because they don't feel the pull, they do, but because they have learned through repeated exposure that external validation is the most unreliable currency in existence. It arrives late, leaves early, and was never actually about you. They are better at distinguishing signal from noise. The young consume everything with equal intensity. Every opinion, every criticism, every piece of encouragement registers at roughly the same volume. People who have been around for a while have developed filtering systems. They know which voices to track and which to let pass. They have a relationship with time that the young cannot access. The young have urgency. The experienced have perspective. And perspective, it turns out, is what allows you to play a long game in a culture that is entirely organized around the short one. They can tolerate ambiguity without collapsing. This is perhaps the most underrated advantage of all. The ability to sit in the middle of an unresolved situation, a relations, a P that hasn't clarified, a project that hasn't included, a feeling that hasn't named itself, without forcing a premature resolution. This is a skill built entirely by surviving situations that didn't resolve neatly. Your advantage is not your experience. Your advantage is your nervous system's response to experience. You have been permanently reconfigured by what you've been through, and that reconfiguration is irreversible. There is a version of all this that becomes its own trap, worth naming it precisely, the hardship as identity trap, when the suffering becomes the story, and the story becomes the only available narrative, and you start using your history as an excuse rather than a context, you've seen it in others. The person who survived something terrible and decided that the surviving was the whole of who they are. So any growth past the wound would feel like a betrayal of the wound. This is the knife held in panic. Gripping the past so tightly it draws your own blood. Not because it protects you, but because releasing it would require deciding who you are. Without it, the knife held with intent looks different. It knows what happened. It carries the weight of what happened without advertising it in every conversation. It uses the clarity that hardship provides, the ability to see clearly, to assess accurately, to prioritize ruthlessly in the service of what comes next. Not in the service of never being hurt again. In the service of something that actually matters. You are not your losses. You are what you built in the rubble where your losses landed. And the question is not whether the rubble shaped you. Of course it did. The question is whether you're building with it or living in it. There is a meaningful, permanent difference between a person whose difficulties gave them depth and a person whose difficulties gave them an excuse. You know which one you've been. The interesting question is, which one you're choosing to be right now. The Joker does not give advice. He gives you posture shifts. Stop using the word still, as in, I'm still figuring things out. I'm still figuring things out. I'm still trying to understand. The word still transforms every ongoing process into an apology. It positions you in permanent incompletion, as though the standard you're being measured against is the finished version of some ideal person who solved everything ahead of schedule. The replacement is not some aggressive self-affirmation. It's simpler than that. It's declarative. Instead of, I'm still trying to find my direction. Try, I'm moving. Instead of, I still haven't gotten over it. Try, I'm accounting for it. Instead of, I feel like I'm behind. Try, I'm exactly where 4 decades of actual living would place a person. Language is not decoration. It is architecture. The internal words you use construct the internal house you live in. If every sentence you say about yourself contains an apology for being in process, for being human, for being nonlinear, for being someone who has been genuinely tested, you are building a house with a structural weakness at the foundation. And no amount of motivational content rearranges the furniture into something load-bearing. Replace the apology words. Methodically, every time you hear yourself diminishing the fact of your own duration on Earth. Certain rooms were designed to make your experience feel like a deficit. Some of those rooms are physical. Workplaces built around the speed and flexibility of people 20 years younger. Social environments organized around performance and aspiration and the breathless forward momentum of people who haven't slowed down enough to question what they're running toward. Some of those rooms are relational. People who knew you before you became who you are, who are invested, deeply, structurally invested, and you remain legible to the version of you they first cataloged, not out of malice, but because your change threatens their map. Some of those rooms are internal. The conversations you have with yourself that were written by someone else's expectations and have been running unquestioned ever since. The audit is simple. For each room you regularly occupy, physical, relational, internal, ask one question. Does this room require me to become smaller to exist in it comfortably? If yes, that is useful information. You do not necessarily need to leave every room that makes you smaller, but you need to know you are making yourself smaller to be in it. Unconscious diminishment is the danger. Conscious choice is something else entirely. You are allowed to choose your battles. You are not allowed to pretend the war isn't happening. The next time someone looks at your age, your experience, your history, your accumulated years of navigating things they haven't encountered yet, and frames it as a limitation, you need 2 internal sentences, not said aloud, just carried. First sentence, you don't have the reference points for this conversation yet. Second sentence, that's not my problem to solve in the next 30 seconds. That's it. Not defensive. Not explanatory. Not an invitation to justify yourself to someone who has not done the reading required to question you meaningfully. Just those 2 sentences. They function as a circuit breaker. They interrupt the reflexive shrinking, the reflexive explaining, the reflexive performance of humility that costs you something every single time. You are not obligated to be legible to people who haven't earned the context to understand you. That is not arrogance. That is simple mathematics. This is not a mantra. It's a decision. Mantras are things you repeat until you believe them. This is something you either decide or don't. The decision is this. The version of yourself that was forged by everything you have survived is the real one, not the pre-difficulty version, not the hypothetical version of you who had better luck and easier weather. The one standing here with exactly this history, exactly this collection of losses and recalibrations and unexpected survivals. This is the primary version, not the backup. Not the compromise. Not the result of things going wrong. The result of things going real. You don't perform this. You don't announce it. You just stop apologizing for it. Stop contextualizing your experience with qualifiers that frame it as a detour from some more legitimate path. Stop introducing yourself as someone who got delayed, derailed, damaged. The mental posture of someone who has genuinely stopped apologizing for who they are is not pride. Pride is loud, and it needs an audience. This is quieter than that. It's the posture of a person who has simply removed, but I'm sorry for the inconvenience, from the end of their own story. You were shaped by your life. That's not a failure of planning. That's how people get built. There is a system. It wasn't built for you. Not for who you actually are. The complicated, weathered, precisely calibrated version of you that exists after everything you've been through. It was built for a certain kind of productivity, a certain kind of legibility, a certain kind of legibility, a model of human value that is organized around velocity and novelty and the specific kind of confidence that requires no history because it hasn't accumulated one yet. The system prefers the early chapters. It rewards the beginning of things, the launch, the debut, the first impression. It is structurally uncomfortable with the middle chapters, with the hard years, with the long, unglamorous stretch where most of the actual thing happens and nobody is watching, and the results are not yet visible, and the only thing keeping you moving is the specific stubbornness of someone who has already lost enough to know that stopping is not actually safer than continuing. The system doesn't know what to do with you. Here's what is actually true about you right now. You are holding more capacity than the framing around you is designed to contain. The emotional range, the tolerance for complexity, the ability to hold contradictions without flinching, the knowledge, bone deep, proof-tested knowledge that the thing you feared did not kill you, and neither will the next thing, and neither will the thing after that. That's not nothing. That's not a consolation prize for aging. That is a functional, transferable, irreplaceable advantage in every domain that actually matters. In relationships, in creative work, in decisions. In the capacity to be genuinely present with another person in their worst moments without disappearing into performance or panic. The young will run bright and fast and loud, and some of them will find a way to what you already carry. And when they do, they will look back at the years it took them and understand, finally, clearly, without the comforting illusion that suffering was optional. What you've known for a while? That the cost was the curriculum. You did not waste those years. You were not set back by what happened to you. You were set apart by it. The question was never whether you could survive what life delivered. You answered that already with your continued presence in it. The question, the only one still worth asking. The question, the only one still worth asking, is whether you're going to spend the remaining decades shrinking yourself to fit the rooms that weren't built for you, or whether you're going to stop asking for permission from people who cannot see what you've become. The answer doesn't need to be said out loud. It just needs to be decided. And unlike the younger version of you, the one still waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right amount of certainty before moving. You know that the decision doesn't require perfect conditions. You've made decisions in the dark, in the wreckage, with nothing but the knowledge that forward was still forward. You already know how to do this. You've been doing it your whole life. That's the advantage. That was always the advantage.